You're watching Experience Comic Culture and Sales, streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Devil's Advocates. I'm your co-host, Christopher, aka the Bronze Age Nerd. And if you know anything about me or you follow my content, you know that one of the things I really enjoy is a nice booty cover, right? I do the booty cover of the week. It's like this fun little thing I like to do because I like to appreciate that part of comic books, the cheesecake art, the bad girl art, the good girl art, all that stuff. The pinups, I really like that stuff. I think it has its place in comic books and I enjoy it. But because I enjoy that stuff, I often get hit with comments that like I must like all the, the full nudity risque covers that are out there, like the sets. You've seen them. You know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. The Naughty and the Nice, the Pharaoh's Lounge, all those cosplay gallery type things. And those things are out there, and I can definitely appreciate those for a moment's, glance and like what they are in a certain way. But at the end of the day, I don't actually collect those things. That always kind of surprises people. But I do admit that they have a place in the hobby and they have a history. And because of that, I just want to take a second to kind of talk about, what it means to have that in the hobby. What does it mean to, why are those things so popular? Why are they so controversial? Because a lot of people really don't like them. And I think that's something we should discuss. On this week's episode, is censorship or freedom really what we're after? And do you need to make up your minds on what you want in the comic book community? Let's talk about it in this week's episode of Devil's Advocates. Hey, Kyle. Welcome to the show. Welcome everybody in chat watching along. Just real fast, I want to say hi to GT Key, Preston, Kenneth, Collector P, Buddy, all you fun, awesome people watching the show. We really appreciate you being in here. This should be an interesting topic. The naughty, the nice, the spicy, the sweet. We're going to get into all of that. Hey, Ferdbird. Hey, Psycho Phil. Awesome to have you guys here. Really appreciate that. We will be opening up the phone lines a little bit later in the show. So just wanted to let you guys know about that as well.
Sorry, I was trying to hold in a burp.
It's all good.
Until I could hit the pause mute button, and then it almost killed me. It was bad.
It happens.
I saw my life flash before my eyes, and it wasn't enough Ninja Turtles card.
Well, when your life flashed before your eyes, were there any sexy covers that came to mind?
No.
Okay.
No.
So yeah, this is a topic that I think definitely divides a huge chunk of the comic collecting community. And I think it's interesting because I think there is a rich history to this topic. Whether or not you think it has its place in modern comics, we're definitely going to get into that. We want to hear your opinions. But you do have to appreciate that this is something that's been around. We're talking about sexual content, erotica, adult content in drawn form. It's been around forever, as long as there's been, stick figures, cave paintings, that kind of stuff. That depiction has existed. And when it comes to comic books, things like propaganda comic books or pulp comic books from the 1930s, prominently featured this type of content. A lot of stuff that was featured for soldiers over in World War II, stuff that was directed at them, to kind of cheer them up or relieve some tension or whatever you want to call it. That kind of content was prevalent. There's the 70s era. You have tons of great stuff there in the grindhouse kind of style era. Lots of stuff, Tijuana Bibles, you name it. So this is something that's been around for a very, very long time. And yet you also have, people that are like saying, hey, comic books are for children, right? Like these are something that should be appropriate for everybody, or we should be, be getting more young readers in. And I agree with that. But at the same time, wasn't Wonder Woman pretty well known as a bondage character early in her days? And look where she's come from that. It's something you got to consider. There's a lot going on with this topic. What do you think, Kyle?
Well, I'll tell you, and I think there's an oversimplification that you made in your intro.
Sure.
Whether it's freedom or censorship, I think is maybe too harsh of a dichotomy.
Okay.
That said, I think part of this, at least for me, is a very thin line. It's not so cut or dry as should or shouldn't there be. And what I mean by that is I don't particularly enjoy or collect those kind of books.
Right.
In fact, I bought a Kickstarter for a book that Dan Wickline, who works here on the Experience, wrote that was kind of in that vein. And I had to wait to back it until I could back it at a level where I didn't get a cover that I had a problem with. So for me, this is a really weird part of the thing to have a conversation about.
Yeah.
But I mean, let's start with some facts here. For instance, you mentioned them, you brought them up, the Tijuana Bibles and these old school kind of ways that these comics first kind of introduce themselves into the collecting vein. And the thing that a lot of people don't know about those is the reason that those exist is because back then the United States military had a policy about pornography and explicit material. So what they would do is they would hide essentially that in these comic books that were real small little, almost like comic strips that they could send to soldiers.
Yeah.
Right. Like that was a way around an existing law or around an existing rule, which is interesting. It's why I don't think censorship is the right word. I think what we really need to decide on isn't whether or not things should be censored. It's whether or not things are needed. And then let's answer the question from there, right? Does your story need to have the main character naked the whole time? Yes or no? Okay, it does. Okay, great. Have fun. Do it. Right? Does your story need risque covers to sell copies? Okay, if it does, great. Have fun. Not going to stop you, right?
Yeah.
But what I see too often, especially in the indie community, are people who mistake nudity or risque content for being edgy, for being interesting, rather than worrying about the story or worrying about, how they've plotted their issue. They're like, well, let's just throw some boobs in it. And that's a disservice to comics. So it's not about censorship or not. It's about need versus justification.
I can respect that. I mean, I think there's definitely like I mentioned in the intro, and this is kind of the crux of the argument you'll see for me the rest of the show is while I don't always enjoy this type of content, I sometimes do. I generally won't collect it. I generally won't buy it. It depends though. I do like, some sexy stuff though. I like to get to a certain point. When it gets to like the full gratuitous nudity, I usually get a little personally kind of turned away from that. But I also understand that there's a lot of people that really enjoy it and that really like it and they want that kind of material. Specifically, they almost are just if that book is there, they'll terrible pun. They'll come to that book, right? They'll get to there and they'll pick it up at their LCS or put it on their pull list or order that, pre-order that Kickstarter or whatever. And I don't want, for me personally, the way I view the community, I don't want to push anybody out from the hobby or from what they enjoy. And at the same time, I really agree with what you're saying, Kyle. Like, I think that it's important to serve the story. And you could tell a story that completely involves that kind of stuff. And it's intrinsic to what that story is. It needs to be there. It's a heavy metal, sci-fi soap opera, like a Lady Death kind of a story, like where that kind of stuff, you'd expect that kind of content to be there. Or you could argue that it has a place there, like heavy metal style stories or whatever. Or that's kind of almost part of the element of the story. Or stories that just, straight up like a movie. A movie is a great analogy for this. There are films that need a love scene between two characters because it's an important plot element or it's an important element for the character development of one or both of those characters or however many characters are involved. And yet there are times where it's very clear that it is introduced sheerly just to be there. Moving slightly aside from movies, talking about television, Game of Thrones, kind of infamously brought in the whole sex position kind of thing where they would talk about, important plot details in a brothel so they could have, gratuitous amounts of nudity going on in the background to keep people entertained and then still tell the story.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting way to look at it is, is it serving the story or not? I think that's a very important point that a lot of people do overlook.
Yeah, it's there's a part of me that comes down very prudish on this. And I'm going to say it. Just because I'm so tired of good stories being drowned out by gratuity.
Yeah.
Or conversely, certain publishers saying we're going to have 65 incredibly sexy covers for this book, but the inside content is going to be awful.
Yeah.
It's, does what you're doing matter, right, to the story? If you want to have a sexy woman on the cover, that's great. But if the interior content sucks, you've missed your job. Right? If you want to have a book with a love scene in it, it should be because, like, I don't know, there's a love scene in the story and not just an excuse to see somebody getting their back blown out in a comic book. It's that idea. And so for me, I'll give you two examples. One is a book called War Lion from our friend Henri Compen. He gave me an early copy of the book to read, and I go, why are they banging like page 1? And he goes, what? And I go, yeah, like, you open the book with a sex scene. I don't know who these people are or why they're doing it. Right? He goes, okay. I go, like, wouldn't this be better later when you know who these people are? Like, even on page 3? And Henri wanted some shock value to start his book.
Okay.
And when you start editing the book and coming down to putting the story together, he realized, oh crap, Kyle's right. We don't understand why these two people are having this intimate moment and discussing the plot to overthrow a rival ruler. You have to figure out that guy's the king first. Like that. Okay, so let's do a couple of pages where they're like at a party and everybody's calling him king, and then you move into this scene. And all of a sudden it takes it from not meaning anything to having a lot of meaning.
Yeah, but so there are some start comments I want to get here, but I want to make a quick rebuttal to that. What if your vision as a storyteller, the way you want the story to be told, is this may not apply to that particular comic. I haven't read it.
Right.
Let's just kind of take a hypothetical here.
Right.
Like I'm a Quentin Tarantino-esque storyteller who wants to tell a story where they want the audience to start out on the tone of that type of content to set up the next, set of panels.
But that's why I turned to him and asked him. Right? Like when you're able to ask a creator and he goes, well, I'm doing it for this reason. Okay, great. But if I'm just picking up your book, I can't do that.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Maybe think about a few introductory panels, something to kind of explain where you're at, right? Even if you're starting in the middle, you've got to come with a way, if you're going to start your book with a full-on sex scene, explaining what this is. Even if you put a title at the top that says, The Palace Bedroom.
Yeah.
Okay, great. These are two people in a palace. It's enough information, right?
Right.
So you have to look at this when you're editing, right? But there's another book out there for me that is equally problematic that goes against that rule, which is why I struggle here. Okay. And that's Tim Seeley's Money Shot. The new volume of Money Shot is not as funny as the first volume was from people I've talked to who have read it. It's not as interesting, and it seems more gratuitous. So are we going more gratuitous because that's the only place left to go at the end of the first volume of this book? Or are we going more gratuitous because the first volume didn't sell enough?
Yeah,
those are your two options at this point when you're reading this book. It's not that you're going more gratuitous because you think the story needs it, because it was already pretty gratuitous in the first book. You're going more gratuitous because you're trying to prove something. And so
you got a good point.
It all comes down to the answer of what does this do for your story for me?
Right.
So there's somebody up here who said a lot of people collect differently.
Mm-hmm.
I know plenty of people who collect for the cover. That's great, but that doesn't make it a good comic book.
Well, hold on. I started that comment because I understand Phil's point, and that is what it is. But on top of that, what about content like it started like in the 90s, the swimsuit issues, the pinup galleries, where the whole point is to have a pinup gallery, and it is in the form of a comic book. It may not tell a story, but it is in comic book form. And the covers and the art, obviously, you had the Marvel Swimsuit Illustrated issues and magazine and comic book size and Lady Death and all of the Top Cow stuff. And they're still done today. What about those types of comic books? I mean, those are clearly designed for that purpose.
But they're not comic books. They're just pinups or art books at comic book size. That's a formatting question.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Right? Like a comic book conveys a comic story. If you're not telling a story, then you could do whatever you want. And that's just a paper size.
Yeah.
That's just a print setup for your layouts. So while they're distributed like comic books, while they're sold like comic books, they aren't. They're art books. And I think in an art book, it's a whole different set of circumstances and rules. Right?
Yeah.
I don't go to the art museum and get offended by a nude that was painted in 1650. Right? The same way I don't get offended at a nude cover in a comic book. What offends me is when you do that just because people will talk about your nude cover.
Yeah, that's understandable. I do think where I completely understand your side of that topic. At the same time, I still defend the fact that you can have an awesome comic book, you can have a mediocre comic book, you can have a terrible comic book, and want to include a variant cover, exclusive cover, a naughty cover for your Kickstarter, something like that. Actually, you see this a lot in Kickstarters where they'll have like a extra backer tier that is, a naughty cover for a book that may not even necessarily justify that. But they're doing that, and it's clearly justifying its existence with sales and backing that Kickstarter. So there's a demand there.
Sure. And again, that's why I ask, why are we doing it? Right.
Yeah.
Like, I would never tell Dynamite not to put out Lucio Perillo variant covers because they're beautiful.
Right.
Right. Like, why are we doing it? Are we doing it because we have this beautiful piece of art? Great. Use it. But don't use it just to be gratuitous. Use it because people like that artist, or it it sells a lot of books, or be able to back up your reasoning is my big answer here, right?
Yeah.
When we're talking about having gratuitous sex, and same with gratuitous violence for me, in a book, tell me why you're doing it or explain to me why that's the way it is in the story. And I'm good. But to do it just because, oh, well, you're going to sell 30 extra, you're going to get people talking about it because your cover is so what your cover is. That's where I start to have a problem.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I have a quick formatting question. When are we going to open up the phone lines on the show? Because I have a sense we might get some callers on this one.
I was kind of waiting for a break time to take our first break.
Okay.
Come back with the phone lines open and we will talk about it.
So before we do that, I do want to address this comment because I think this is kind of an important thing considering the conversation we're having. Mm-hmm. This commenter, I'm sorry, something Digi artist, JD Smith Digi artist. Kyle, it's really hard to comment when the auto mod cracks down on even censored words. This is coming from Twitch. I believe Twitch's auto mod is a little bit more aggressive, right?
Yeah, and the problem is that we have Twitch's auto mod turned down as low as it'll go. Shy of turning it off, which I can't do, I don't think.
And even if you did, it'd include like, bots doing all kinds of stuff in chat we wouldn't want probably too. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to address that because I think that it's a fair point, but you could also try to switch over to another format where you can maybe more freely comment or watch simultaneously, maybe, if that's an issue. But sorry you're encountering that problem.
Yeah, while we're going through the break, I'll try and get Twitch sorted. But yeah, Twitch is really a problem that there's not a ton I can do about.
All right, that makes sense. Cool. Yeah. So it sounds like we're going to take our first little commercial break here, and we're going to get ready to open up those phone lines. Again, I have this sinking suspicion that there is going to be at least a couple of you out there that want to have your voices heard on this topic, and we would absolutely love to hear from you on that too.
Absolutely. Let me see if I can get this figured out while we're in break.
To be continued. 3 little words that hold the secret to the next great story. 3 words that will thrill you, confound you, give life to new possibilities. Every variation of to be continued is a promise of adventure, a promise of excitement, a promise of unseen wonders and unexplored worlds. A promise that every issue you read makes you a part of a never-ending journey, and behind every page there will be an unopened door waiting for you. This story to be continued at your local comic book shop today. Visit comicshoplocator.com today.
You know how when you go to Comic-Con, after Comic-Con, you go to the hotel bar, and there's a whole bunch of people playing music and dancing, and you've got Pikachu and Lara Croft Tomb Raider doing the cha-cha slide just down from Deadpool and Batman and Wonder Woman? That's every Saturday night over on the Experience Twitch channel. Join Taji Beats for the EXP Dance Party, exclusively on Twitch, twitch.tv/the_EXP.
Imagine being at a convention and going to an interview panel that's just for you. No bustling crowds, no hours-long lines, just you, the moderator, and your favorite comic book creators. Well, this is pretty much that. Miss Jen sits down every week with 2 comic book creators for a live stream interview about their latest work, and you can ask them whatever you want. It's Talking Shop, Mondays at 5 Eastern on The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales.
All right, we are back, everybody. So yeah, what's the phone number this week for the call-in, Kyle? There we go. Right there on the bottom of the screen, you'll see that. If you guys want to give us a buzz, I would absolutely love to hear from everybody on this topic. Get your takes on things, your questions you might have, hypotheticals, that kind of stuff too. So while we're waiting for a call to come in, I will say, so Kyle, while your arguments here are very logical and cogent to me, I do have this issue with a large segment of the comic book collecting community, which I don't think you fall into, even though you're kind of maybe on the other side of the coin for me a little bit when it comes to this. There is just like this kind of almost like this knee-jerk reaction group of the community too, that just is like, nope, hate it. I just don't want it in my comic books. I don't want it on comic books at all. And I'm being a little dismissive when I say that, because I don't understand that argument. So especially if you have that viewpoint, it'd be great to hear from you in chat to kind of see where you come from. I see when, some of these, exclusive sets that, there's kind of the nice, the naughty, and then the super naughty version. And there's these, 3 cover sets that get brought up. People, there was a Dr. Afro one recently where everyone's like, oh, I love the nice cover. And as you got to the other covers, people were, very dismissive of that. And in my head, it's like, well, why not just buy the nice cover? If you like the nice cover and you like the art, there you go. There's your book. But a lot of other people definitely have this almost, I don't know if it's a zero tolerance for them. I don't know if it's the type of book it's on. And I'm really trying to get to the bottom of what that type of collector feels like. So if anybody out there shares those opinions, don't be afraid to speak up. I respect your opinion and I want to hear about it. Absolutely.
So something I want to address, and I don't know if maybe, Mark missed our conversation the other night. The comment was, what makes me an arbiter of what is a comic book? And I want to just take a second and remind everyone, it's this. Co-host on the show, just my opinions. Like, this is just our opinions. If I tell you Sandman's not a comic book because it's better than a comic book and it's it's exceeded what a comic book is, that's because that's my opinion. So, just remember, when we say things that you don't necessarily agree with, we're not saying your opinion isn't valid. We're saying that this is our opinion.
Yeah, and by the same token, Kyle just alluded to it. I want to point out, I know a lot of people in here are regulars from watching on my channel, and you're over here now, and that is fantastic. I really appreciate that. Make sure you give a sub. Make sure you do a thumbs up on this stream so we can kind of help this show kind of start out strong. But one thing I do want to point out is we did do an interview the other night over on my channel. For those of you who may not be as familiar with Kyle, and I think that was a great introduction to maybe some of his thoughts, some of his history on comic books, and something I'd recommend checking out if you're a regular viewer.
Absolutely.
Oh, the finger. Yeah. Okay.
No, I found the auto mod controls.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Now I don't know what any of it means.
By the way, I also saw this comment when I was scrolling back up to look at Mark's. You're totally right, Murdoch. There were stories in those Marvel swimsuit specials. I shouldn't have lumped those all in completely, but you're also right. It's probably not why most people were buying it.
Right. And again, it's one of those things that if you can tell me in your story, but through the way you tell your story in your comic book or in your title or in your solicitation of a book, why you've made the choice you've made, I will pretty much forgive anything. Right. But the thing that I keep getting stuck on are, and I see them a lot when I go on Kickstarters and other places, it's, hey, we're doing our version of the Three Little Pigs story. And here's a photo where all three pigs are hot chicks with no clothes on. What does it have to do with your story? What does it have to do with your story? Like, you're making a book that's, kind of based on a kid's concept, and now you're dropping, this weird cover. Now, is it you're doing an erotic version of the Three Little Pigs where the big bad wolf is, okay, just say erotic version.
Or is it an allegory for something else that,
right,
maybe is important to the story?
Right. Tell me those things.
Most of the time, probably not.
Right. Tell me those things, and I can super easily get behind what you're doing. It's a lot harder for me when it's just, I don't, when we don't know what you're talking about, why you're doing what you're doing.
Sensuality on all the Kickstarter covers is a huge turnoff for you. Yeah. And that makes sense. I do get the, like I said, I'm not really a collector of these. I can count on one hand, and I've got, thousands of comics. I can count on one hand the number of those types of covers that are like that fully explicit stuff that I actually own. And that surprises people when they hear that, because I do have a lot of the more nice versions of stuff for sure. Like one thing I will often do is if I like a cover, if I like the art, I'll buy that set and I'll just sell off the nude or risque version because it goes for more later on anyway. And it basically pays for my purchase of the whole set. But I get it. I really do understand that. I also think that the other side of that is what B Price is saying up above, which is if you don't want it, don't buy it.
Right.
Which, speaking with your dollars is a very important consumer, collector, comic book related industry, both in supporting those people that you want to succeed and also, maybe choosing not to support things you don't like to see.
Right. And that's it. Like I'm one that will speak with my dollar in that regard. Right. I don't buy certain things because of any number of reasons. I don't buy books that I don't like.
Yeah.
But at the same time, sometimes a book I like, I have to remind myself why I like it because of choices they make. So it's this weird kind of dichotomy you have to walk as a comic collector. Now, I don't go in for this. There's no place for it in comics. That's completely wrong. That's backwards. But I think it's like using swearing in comics. If you use it right, it's more powerful than if you use it often. Mad Spidey, what's up, buddy? It's that whole Bill Russell throw an elbow thing, right? Do it once or twice, well timed, well executed, and every time you do it is going to be a big deal. do it all the time and it's not special anymore.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And let's check out this comment here from Murdoch. Is it just about the covers from the material inside? Because I'll argue that certain adult comics like Omaha, The Cat Dancer, and Cherry Pop-Tart are great, but very adult comics. So,
Right,
yeah,
and-
what do you say to that, Kyle?
Well, and if you read Omaha Cat Dancer, all of the nudity and all of the adult content makes sense. Cherry Pop-Tart was a protest book. Like, so when you look at the history of that book, now you know why, right? Why they make the choices they make. It's the same idea, right? Like, and I'll make an even more extreme example, Howard Chaykin's Black Kiss. If you've never read that, that is one of the, I would say, foremost sexually important comics to come out of the AIDS era. Right? Like, this was a book about people who were trans and gay and living these alternative lifestyles when nobody else was.
Mm-hmm.
Or when nobody else was making books about it. And Howard Chaykin had the stones to do it. Well, knowing the context of when the book came out and what the book is, when you see male genitalia in that book, it makes sense. It answers for itself because it's an important part of the story. If Howard Chaykin had just drawn a story about people going to crazy parties and taking their clothes off, maybe it would have made less sense. But you have to take the context of the whole into it, not just the cover or the nudity. It's why Karma by Dan Wickline, the nudity makes total sense in the book because he's talking about the way people in that industry act, right? He's giving examples of things that actually happened in his life that are part of this story. Are they maybe a little sensationalized? Yes. But it's this example. So the line for me again is we're just going to make that character be naked. Well, why? Just because we can.
Mm-hmm.
Not because it has anything to do with the story, but we're just going to have that happen. And I see it happen a lot of the times in stories like Betty Page, where all of a sudden there's just a scene where Betty is changing her clothes. You don't know anything about it. She's just done a photo shoot or, somebody spilled mustard all over the front of her at a dinner. You don't know any of that. She's just all of a sudden changing her clothes. Why is Betty Page all of a sudden changing her clothes in the middle of this story? Clearly it's because you can. Not because you need her to.
Or, while I agree with you, just to kind of play the devil's advocate card, is it because fans coming to that story expect that out of the storyline?
Sure, but
you're talking about a famous pinup model.
Sure, absolutely. And that takes me back to that. Give me a reason for it.
Yeah.
Right? If you put a Betty Page pinup on the cover, do you need a Betty Page pinup on the inside? Right? Give me a reason for it.
Well, and here's to be the very literal answer. The amount of times, completely aside from this discussion, that I've heard somebody say, yeah, it's on the cover, but it's not even on the inside.
Well, and that's the thing. If that's the feedback you're getting,
yeah,
put it on the inside. Like, I'm all for that kind of idea. What I don't love is just here it is. We're going to put it in anyway. What I don't love is we could have come up with a more thought out idea and written it a different way and used a different allegory.
Yeah.
For what we're trying to say, but we're going to choose sex. Well, sometimes it's laziness is where these things happen. And that again is another problem. If you can find a better way to tell a story than with sex, you should. If you can't, then use sex because it's the best way to tell the story.
Yeah, and on face value, that I totally agree with that. Like, if you can find a better way, I don't care what the topic is, then you should, violence, drama, romance. If there's a better way to do it, the better way should always be how you go. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, and
yeah, good point, Mark. Sexual
but
use sex to tell a story. Yep.
have you read Sex Criminals, Mark? Like all of it? There's no way to tell the story you want to tell without it.
Yeah.
Like
I think
that
that's what you're saying.
the whole reason that book exists is because that's the only way to tell those stories.
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense to include it. And then because you're telling the story that way, it makes perfect sense to make the pink poly bag variants.
Kind of as opposed to Money Shot, where it may be
where, oh, you want to talk about we need to find other ways to make money for our space station? There are other ways to do it than starting an OnlyFans, which is essentially the premise of that book.
Yeah.
I
did want to. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Cal.
No, I just want to say there are other ways that story could be told.
I did want to address K-pop's comment. It was a little bit longer ago, but I thought it was a good comment when I was scrolling back up. And I think this might be in relation to Kickstarters. I'm thinking it's also a way for some artists to have creative control over a piece they want to do, instead of being told to tone it down. Not just the readers that enjoy it, which is interesting. K-pop is an artist. A lot of artists out there do have a vision. They do have a story they want to tell. I think, and I have a feeling Kyle will agree with this. My advice would be like, yeah, you could do that for sure, but does it have a purpose in the context of what you're trying to put out there? And it very well could. And I think there's really great ways to do that too.
So when I was in my early 20s, I did some stand-up just because I wanted to see if I could do it. And the way I was taught and what I was told, and it was a really good example, or really good lesson. Don't cuss until you've got more than 5 minutes of material. When you've got 5 minutes of material you can do, you can cuss. And the idea is that once you can write your first 5 minutes without cussing, in your second 5 minutes, if you cuss, they're going to notice you cussed. And so you can use it as a laugh line or as an exclamation point. If you just come up and be like, F this, F that, F this, F that, you're never going to have any high points in your act. You're never going to have any moments. So for me, with nudity in comics and on covers, do it less. Do it when it matters the most. And it's gonna be a lot more. What's the word I'm looking for here? Impactful than just doing it to do it.
I agree with the thrust of what you're saying. I'm going to keep using every slightly innuendo type thing I can do in this chat the entire time. I agree with the main thrust of that, but I do also think that it's just important to continually reframe that, in that it depends a lot on the type of story you're telling. And I want to get to, I'm going to use this as a transition to talk about 78 points of articulation comment here, to address the content of what he's saying and specifically in our context here. So it's cool to have Perio art on a Dynamite book, which often has nothing to do with the interior story, but it's not okay to have a lesser known artist do it. Now, I will say here, to me, what sticks out to me about that comment is when you're talking about like Perio doing this on like a Deja or a Vampirella. Let's say Vampirella, because he's done so many great Vampirella covers. When you're talking about one of those Vampirella books, who is Vampirella? She's this super ultra sexy vampire that is, meant to inspire lust so that she can seduce you, so that she can, be that vampire, right? I mean, that's the core of the aesthetic of that character. So that makes tons of sense. Now, when it comes to a lesser known artist doing it, I think it really depends on, again, like, if they were doing a Vampirella cover, it would almost certainly be okay, depending on the cover, of course, but it depends. It depends on, I don't think it has to do with the fame of the artist so much as, again, the context, the greater context of that book.
And if you talk to somebody from Dynamite, they're going to tell you that the Lucio Perillo variants sell better than most other covers. So even if it doesn't make a ton of sense, the justification for doing it makes sense. My argument for this whole thing isn't about why we're doing it. It's about how do we justify why we're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's Mark says comics are not really for kids anymore. I don't think that's true. So I see it from a mercenary sense, why they make I think you meant monetary sense, why they make sexy covers to move copies. It's true. And if that's the whole reason you're doing it, then you need to be able to say, I made a sexy cover because I'm going to sell 65% more copies of this than of the other cover.
But hold on though. I gotta. The first thing you said there was comics aren't really for kids anymore. You said you don't really agree, right?
I don't really agree that comics aren't for kids anymore. I will go ahead and stipulate that some comics are not for kids.
Would you agree that most comics aren't directed at kids these days?
No.
Okay. Interesting.
I would agree that it's somewhere less than most.
Okay. But not a tiny percentage.
No, certainly not.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because I think that's an important part, and I it's something I brought up in my notes here, and I didn't probably hit on this point enough because this is an important part of this discussion. Is what it throws me back to immediately is in the 90s going to a comic book shop when you had like Linsner Dawn covers that were at the time pretty explicit or whatever you want to call it, or early Lady Death covers, those kinds of things that were really eye-catching to an adolescent boy, or a lot of other people for that matter. Lady Rawhide, Vampirella, all these different things. And I always in my head, something I put in my notes here too, is that I always associated that a little bit with like the curtain at a video rental store in the same kind of era, right? There's always this like section, and there's a taboo around it, maybe, or a enticement, depending on how you feel about that kind of stuff. But I do think that it's something that it always coexisted peacefully in my LCSs because there was an area for it. It wasn't like, hey, it's mixed in here with the the Batman Adventures comics or something like that too. It had its own section. So if you didn't want to go up and approach that stuff, you didn't have to.
Well, and I'll say this, the one thing I did when I took over my store was get rid of that section.
Yeah.
I didn't want comic books in my store that I couldn't sell to anyone. Now, that's not to say that I wouldn't say, hey, this is maybe not for you 13-year-old kid. But I didn't want comics in my store that I had to worry about policing who went behind the curtain and not. Right? Like, that was just a decision I made. So for that, on that regard, I had the same feeling, right? I grew up in a shop that had one of those, but I didn't want to have to deal with it. So the easiest thing for me to do was to liquidate those books and never have to think about them again.
And that's totally fair. I mean, I definitely went into shops where, as far as I could tell, there was no section like that too. Generally, they just replaced that square footage with baseball cards.
Magic the Gathering, but yeah,
exactly. Later on, yeah, for sure. But yeah, it is an interesting point. I would push back a little bit on but it sounds like we agree. It's just the percentage we disagree about. But I think a huge section, whether you could say it's majority, minority, half and half, whatever, of comic books is not primarily intended to be targeted at kids because a huge proportion of the buyers are not children. And even if they are parents and buying for the kids, and by the way, I wish that was different. I 100% wish that people were buying more comic books for kids because we need those young readers so badly. I don't want to miss that point. But I do think at the same time that most of the people I see reading, your big comic books that are out there that are moving a lot of volume are not children. Of course, there are children reading those books. I'm not going to say there's not. But again, I don't want to, quibble on the percentage. I just think it's important to bring that up is if we're going to talk about the whether or not it's suitable for children to be in that environment kind of question, it is important to point out that, most of the time that I go in an LCS, I don't see many kids in there. And at the same time, it's almost like the opposite, right? There almost always in an LCS is a kids section that is, and that's wonderful, by the way. You got your Sonic books or your Star Wars adventures or all that kind of great content over there. which is a great place for them to be. And if I was in a shop and I saw the types of books we're talking about marketed or close to that section, I would have a problem with that for sure. Like that would be an issue in my mind.
Right. It's when we talk about comics aren't meant for kids, and I say I don't agree with that statement. I believe that most comics are made that anyone could read them. Right? I don't believe that we're excluding kids from comic books these days. That being said, the gatekeeping that comes along with long-running titles and titles that have been skewed mature or for teenagers or older is part of the reason that this industry is dying. Period.
Yeah.
If we keep making books that appeal to men in their mid-40s who want to get their rocks off looking at a cover, then pretty soon we're going to have no one buying comics. I mean, it's just the truth. So in a world where both things have to exist, we have to find a way to balance, which is, again, what I'm going back to, this idea of if you want to use sex or you want to use gratuity, use it more sparingly and use it to great effect than to use it all the damn time and have it mean nothing.
Yeah, it's an important point, and I don't want to in any way dismiss the point, because on the greater good of the topic, if I had to trade one for the other, adult comics for having more youth and young readers in comic books, I would choose the latter in a heartbeat. My issue, though, is I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think there is a market to serve both. And I think that comes from my philosophy that I want more readers, more buyers, more everything in comic books. And I don't think the kind of artist or the kind of person that's going to be doing that kind of book, the kind of publisher that's going to be putting out that kind of book, is going to be like, well, we're not doing that Donald Duck book and we're going to do this, XXX book instead. I think there is room for both. And I think the person who's going to be buying that book wouldn't have bought the other book too. So it's not necessarily
right
desaturating the market, in my opinion. It's more of just kind of another avenue for collectors to pursue.
Sure. And again, that's where that balance comes in that we're talking about, right? Like if we make one or the other, we're making our bed and have to lie in it one way or the other. You have to make both. But more often than not, I see people going one direction and not the other. And that's by publisher, right? You have publishers who specifically lean into making adult content and not making anything else. And then you have publishers who specifically lean into making only content for kids.
Yeah.
Well, when was the last time you read a Scoot book from Scoot Comics? Because all they do is make kids' books. They're great books.
Mm-hmm.
But when was the last time you read one? Conversely, when was the last time you read a book by somebody like Boundless? Right? That it's literally just porn. Right? So there's this middle ground we have to find, we have to fight for in the comic book world. And Mark, this is an attack on what we're talking about in absentia, essentially. You're talking about the price of comics. The price of comics is a whole nother debate for a whole nother day, if we want to talk about gatekeeping. But part of what we're gatekeeping right now, what we're talking about, are books that come out that specifically you can't even see if you're a little kid or if you're a young reader. Right? Yeah. And I think the fact that exists in such high numbers means that there's so much less on the rack for kids. Because here's where we need to talk about cost. Retailers, right? They're having to pay for one or the other. They can't pay for both. So if your retailer had a few less Linsner covers to order, or a few less Boundless comics to order, they could maybe order a few more comics that are accessible to everyone. And whether or not the price point at $4 or $5 is the problem, which it certainly is part of the problem, it's still increasing opportunity instead of diminishing opportunity.
I'm gonna highlight this comment. Figure drawing. I love you being part of the chats, and you do make great comments. I want to elaborate on your comment a little bit here. The industry is not dying. I think it was in reaction to something I said. But my point when I was saying that, and this could be a great topic for a future Devil's Advocate show, by the way, and then your follow up, which I will include. Dying in the hyperbolic sense. I mean, look, I don't think comics are not going to die in 10 years. Comics are not going to die in 15 or 20 years. However, you look at 15, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we are talking about much less numbers being produced. We are talking about a much shallower industry. So I don't see that as a graph that's going to continually go towards zero to the point where the comic industry is dead. But I do think it's a good sign that comics need to evolve. I do think it's a good sign that we need to change some things about what we're doing. And conversations like this, in my opinion, are part of that solution, or at least part of the process to finding a solution, right? But I love you bringing up that comment. And I'm sorry if I came across a certain way when I made that. And I do think this would be an excellent thing to talk about for a future episode.
And I'm the one who said the industry is dying.
Okay. I thought I said
No, I said it, and I mean it. But I mean it largely in the same way Bronze just kind of defined it, we're looking at an industry that compared to the previous 3 years is down over 400%. Like, that's not health. Now, granted, some of that has to do with no one has free money anymore. And inflation is through the roof and all kinds of economic stuff that we could talk about. But the industry's down a lot. And so by not including the future and guaranteeing there will still be buyers 20 and 30 and 40 years from now, we're not doing our job in terms of keeping the industry healthy.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by when I say the industry's dying. The industry's sick. And part of the reason I chose Scoot and Boundless is that they're the far-flung ends of the spectrum. Scoot is an imprint of Scout Comics that only does kids and all ages books, and Boundless is a company that exists over here literally only to make nudie books. Like, they are the furthest ends of the spectrum here, and the fact that no one's heard of them is kind of the point. They exist so far on the fringes, nobody should have heard of them.
By the way, my answer to your question is, which one have I read more recently? And the answer is the same for both. Neither. Right. Which is kind of funny, actually, because I really should get my hand on some Scoot comic books, because my daughter is just getting to that age where that's the kind of material that I need to start introducing her more of, because I definitely read comic books to her, but it's My Little Pony, it's Max Meow, it's a few more.
And Stanley the Snowman, man. That's
a good one. I've got a free comic book day of that set aside in her pile. So yep.
No, it's true. It's just this idea of anything we're doing that keeps someone from being able to read a comic is making it harder for someone to read a comic, which is making it harder to make new fans, which is making it harder to Lisa, you know it. Making it harder to grow.
That's awesome. Good comment, Lisa. So speaking of keeping comics out of the hands of people, there's one element, do you have a heart out tonight, Kyler? Or do you free to go for a little bit? Okay. So one element of this that I really wanted to talk about, and it's something that this is great conversation. And by the way, chat, you are on fire tonight. I love what you're bringing. I love the points you're bringing up. Absolutely keep us honest on what we're saying. Or
real quick, Naughty or Nice asked which industry is down 400%. Comics in general. The overall pop culture market is down. That includes TCGs, action figures. It includes all the mainline stores. We're talking about overall numbers, not just local comic shop numbers.
Gotcha. So the other element I wanted to talk about a little bit, and this is
that's a great one.
It is. There's been a few.
Thank you for picking up the slack for us there, Mark.
You said something about the rack earlier, and I was going to interject, but this is when I say censorship, I'm being a little, that's a high 30 miles in the sky kind of view of what I'm talking about. One way I think that takes a form is, and the best example for me of this is eBay. If you have these kind of comic books and you do want to sell them, you have any kind of comic books in your collection, you want to sell those comic books, the one type of comic book that you are going to catch hell on selling on eBay is this type of comic book. And that's even if you censor the image to beyond reasonable measures. I know a lot of sellers that have had their accounts suspended. They've had their accounts limited by places like eBay. You talk about, you want to be an artist and show off your work on certain platforms. You could show off a classical painting. You could show off, classical forms of nudity. You want to show off nudity in a modern comic art form. Not happening on most platforms. And no, there are a few that allow it, of course, with there's exceptions to every rule. And I brought up eBay, so I feel like I need to give Whatnot for the one thing I think they deserve credit for, is Whatnot will allow you to show and sell adult comic book material, and they don't allow it for pretty much anything else, as far as I'm aware. I think it's specifically comic books that they will allow it for on their platform. It is not very often that you hear me give Whatnot credit for something, but I do have to give them some credit for that. But what about, Kyle, chat? What do you think about eBay or places like this not allowing that kind of material to be sold, even if the sellers are self-censoring the material to make it safe? While, by the way, let's not take away the fact that there are plenty of adult content listings on eBay. Things like Playboys, things like, I think they've cracked down on this, but I remember there used to be like nude photos of like starlets and stuff being sold on there, old pinups, that kind of stuff. You do see that type of content on there, and it's not affected the same way that comic books are. Why is that? What do you guys think the reason is for that?
Sorry, I was reading the chat talking about if you get comics at Books and Million or Barnes and Nobles.
Okay.
And I could speak to that in a minute. But I had a friend who's a retailer who was really the person who turned me on and kind of explained to me Boundless Comics. And they were ordering one of each of their XXX covers because they could pay $2.50 for it, put it on eBay for $50 and sell it. And that's kind of how that system worked. I don't like these platforms taking things down and not allowing you to sell stuff. I'm not a fan of censorship.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of, and again, that's kind of been my whole point the whole night, is I don't want to censor anybody. I want to know, or I want to be explained why you've made the choices you've made. So do it with your storytelling or do it in your solicitations. Any platform taking that kind of stuff down is restriction of commerce. Here's the problem you have. Any schmuck can make an eBay account. Any kid who doesn't know any better, who has access to his parents' debit or credit card, could make an eBay account and buy stuff. There really is no kind of two-factor authentication in terms of who is buying what. So when you're selling adult material on a platform like eBay, you run the risk of selling to people who you can't, it's illegal for you to sell them to, or selling it to places where that thing is illegal. Did you guys know if you go to Utah, like all the Wi-Fi networks in Utah won't let you access the hub?
And of course, you're talking about Comic Hub, right?
Right.
No, yeah, okay. But
if you're if you're in Ohio and you sell a comic book on eBay and it goes to Utah, you've broken the law. So now people are suing eBay because they're getting sued because they broke the law. So that's from a business standpoint, it's easier to say, look, we don't allow this here than it is to say we do allow this and leave yourself open to trouble.
Okay. So
that said,
sorry.
these laws that restrict these things and cause you to have broken the law and cause you to have gotten all this trouble are far too draconian and should be done away with. That's kind of what I'm getting at. I don't think it should be eBay's problem, right? I get it, but I don't think it's right that it exists the way it happened.
Okay.
And I'll tell you from my own example, when I had my store in Sylvania, Ohio, in order to sell old Playboys, I had to have a special license. That special license cost me $10. But it basically meant that I went and I filled out the form that said I understood the laws in that municipality around how I can display these books, who I can let buy these books, this kind of stuff. I couldn't sell them on Sunday. Why? Because this little suburban town had a law that says you can't sell anything rated M or harder on Sunday. So GameStop couldn't sell you God of War on Sunday. Like, it was a dumb law. But it was the law. And so I started selling old Playboys that would come into the store in comic book collections. And then I get in trouble. I have to pay a fine. So instead of selling them, I just stopped selling them. Right? Instead of going and getting this license, I just stopped selling them. So for me, I think the laws need to go away, but I think as long as they exist, we need to find a way to respect them. And so with Whatnot, they have more factors of identification, right? It's much harder to create a Whatnot account with no one knowing, right? If you're a little kid, it's much harder to get on some of these places than it used to be on eBay. So that's kind of why I feel that, I think it happens.
Okay. So, and apologies for jumping in earlier. I thought I sensed a pause there. When it comes to that, so, and I understand that eBay is not the same as the other retailers I'm about to mention, and they definitely can have their own policies to protect themselves in place, of course. But the irony there is you then have anybody in the world can go to the publisher in a lot of these cases, or at least the exclusive group that is putting out these comics, a large majority of these comics. I could just even some of the main comic book online retailers, you could go to their websites and purchase these comics, and there's almost no threshold for age gating anybody buying them. Now, again, I don't want to make a false comparison here, because obviously eBay is a big company. They want to protect their butts when it comes to certain things. My counterpoint would be that it'd be great to have, in the case of like somebody as large as eBay, where a lot of comic books are bought and sold, a huge amount of them, it would be great for them to have a gated, type of section, the digital black curtain, if you will, so that you could do that. Because I mean, obviously, like you just said, places like Whatnot are a little bit more strict on that. Theoretically, account holders are 18, etc., because of the nature of the business.
Right.
But yeah, I want to spin off of this. I think 78 Points of Articulation made a great point that is a cool way to look at this that I hadn't considered before. The first comment was, another way of looking at addressing today's topic and bringing the kids aspect. Ryan Gonzalez has found much success making her cutie chibi anime style for mainstream books. Her covers have nothing to do with the interior story. They're just there for her art and appreciation. That's a really good point. The argument the cover was made to sell the book is obsolete because every single cover's primary goal is to help sell the book. That's a good point. You think about a Scotty Young, you think about some of these other covers that have nothing to do with the interior. It's a little bit like what I said earlier.
Let me ask a question. When was the last time you bought a cover and didn't know the name of the cover artist? The artwork that a cover artist does to help sell the book is almost less important than the name of the cover artist in a lot of these examples. Right? Every cover artist we've mentioned tonight has been a big name comic book artist. That's not to say you don't buy comics without, knowing who the cover artist is. But when we talk about these things, a lot of times the names we're talking about when we have these arguments are big names. It's not Joe down the street who publishes his own book. And a lot of us buy those books because we're supporting Joe down the street. It's about the name that's attached to it, not just what's on the cover.
But a lot of those names that are big in the adult comic book scene are big names.
Yeah. But that's what I'm saying is, so when you attach that big name to your book, you're doing it to sell covers, right? You're doing it to sell the book. The piece of art doesn't really matter that much. You know you're going to get something killer. If you hire Joe Linsner to do a cover, you know you're going to get an incredible piece of art. And you know that by hiring him, it's going to sell more copies. So you've done the two things. You've ensured you're going to sell more copies, and you've got a great cover art.
Murdoch makes a good point that's along the lines of what we're talking about right now, kind of an extension of this discussion. Scotty Young is a great example of someone who could sell great to kids, but I sure as hell don't want a kid reading I Hate Fairyland, or its alternate title, F Fairyland. I mean, that's a fantastic, adding some color context to this particular part of the discussion. 100% agreed, Murdoch.
Right. And there are definitely those. Christy Shin is an independent creator who I think falls into that realm too, right? It's one of those, she does this kind of unique and weird art style, but the inside of the book is so vulgar that, you wouldn't want kids reading it, but kids would like it.
Yeah, interesting. So to me, I guess, kind of where I'm keep coming to in this conversation, not just in tonight, but also other times I've had this conversation, is that there is this segment of the comic book collecting population that just has an issue with this type of content. And what I'm learning, and this is fantastic, I'm so glad I'm learning this tonight, that there are different arguments within that faction. And some of those arguments are great. Some of those arguments, just like anything, some of those arguments are, in my opinion, mediocre. Some of them are not as strong. But it is nice to know a little bit more of the context and see this from the other side. This is a huge part of why we do this show. It's a huge part of what we want to learn about, is how the other side of an argument can see the topic, and potentially change opinions, or at the very least help one side understand the other side a little bit more too. And I think that's something that I'm learning tonight, which is great. I still will always come back to anytime, like what I said at the top of the show, I do not love these covers for the most part. Now, do I appreciate them? If you were to show me an image that was a cool cover in this vein, yeah, there's a chance I'd be like, that's cool. Doesn't mean I'm going to shell over, 30, 40, $50 to buy the thing like these often go for, or much more in some cases. And I'm not going to make that part of my collection. I don't want to hand that down to my kids someday, that kind of thing. However, there are exceptions to that rule where it's like, to me, that is a cool enough piece of art where I'm willing to do that very rarely. But at the same time, all that said, I am going to fight for the right to party Beastie Boys style here and say that those things have a place. They have a reason to exist in the hobby. And not only because I don't agree with censorship in general, but also because I know there's a lot of fans out there of it that are buying it specifically for that. And I would, if I was a fan of, let's say somebody was to flip the coin, flip it completely, and you were to say, well, having mutant characters in comic books is offensive and we shouldn't have them and we need to restrict the sales on those, that would offend me greatly, because I love reading X-Men comic books.
Well, and I think I will make my closing point this. I don't want to yuck anybody's yum.
Yep.
If it's for you, great. Do it. But don't expect other people for whom it's not to support that decision or to, endorse that decision. That's not their job. I am not a huge fan of, as I've said so many times, nudity for nudity's sake, or sex for sex's sake.
Right.
If you're using it as a plot point, you're using it as a device, you're using it because, hey, that's the killer piece of art that your cover artist wanted to do. Fantastic. I'm not going to stop you. But I'm also not going to buy your book. And that's the end, right? Like that's where I stand. I don't want anyone to stop you from selling your book, but I'm not going to buy it. And when it comes down to it, that's the calculus every creator and every publisher and everybody has to make, right? You're going to do what you're going to do because that's what you want to do. But you got to be okay with when somebody says, hey, I don't dig it. You have to be okay with that answer.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. And I mean, yeah, that's just to kind of dovetail where I think we have a lot of common ground here, Kyle. I completely agree that, it's almost like a vote with your dollar situation. You support what you want to see in the comic book community, but be accepting of other people's opinions, whether it's for or against the thing you like or don't like. Just respect that opinion and try to open up that dialogue. One comment I got earlier today when I posted some promo material for this stream was somebody came in my DMs and they were talking about this topic, and then they brought up the Do You Poo covers, and they kind of put all this in the same kind of ballpark because they don't like both things. Boy, you want to talk about something I can 100% relate to? I do not like the Do You Poo variant covers. I straight up don't like a single one I've ever seen. I have no place for them. You tell me that you collect them and you buy them and, you love it because when you were a kid, Winnie the Pooh was your favorite, character, and you think it's awesome there's all these Do You Poo variants. Okay, cool. I'm glad you're out there buying comics. I'm glad you're out there supporting what you like. And you can flip the script and talk, definitely about this topic as well.
Can I tell you a funny story?
Sure.
The colorist on those Do You Poo variants is a very good friend of mine.
Uh-huh.
I've never bought one. Like, I know his work. I've sat in his living room and watched him draw them. Like, watched him color them, watched him ink Merritt Michaels and some of the other people who have done those covers.
Mm-hmm.
And not one of them has ever said to me, you know what, you should buy this. No interest. That doesn't mean I don't support the book. It just means I'm not going to spend my money on it.
Right.
And at the end of the day, that's where all of this is, right? We're trying to figure out how to most effectively spend our comic book collecting dollar. We're trying to figure out how to most efficiently support the things we like. And the easiest way to do that is just not to buy the stuff you don't like. But like I've said before, if you like it, buy it. And if there's enough money to be made, these companies will keep making them.
Absolutely. And as we get to the end of the show here, I do want to take a second. A lot of people came in. I really want to thank everybody that came in here. And, BFit came in at the end. John Stout. We had Nick Burici pop in here. So many people that we didn't necessarily get a chance to say hello to. Chat, I am serious. You guys were on fire tonight. I love what you were doing. I hope to see you all here next week when we're talking about a new topic. And as we just posted a link in the chat, you can go suggest that new topic for us over on our website and go ahead and give us that next talking point. You also can do that by dropping us a DM. You could leave a comment on this video if you're watching on the rewind, or go check out that link, however you like to do it. But we want to hear what you guys want to hear us debate here on Devil's Advocates. And I absolutely love all of you coming into the chat and giving us your opinions. That is so valuable, and it added so much to this conversation. So thank you so much for that, folks.
Yeah. And then just as a reminder, 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific, new start time going forward. Be watching for other stuff on the experience. We've got some cool stuff happening and coming up. And we will see everybody later.
Have a great night.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.